What happens when a mother is tried and found guilty of murdering her babies? What could drive a mother, once celebrated for her compassion and intelligence, to take the lives of her own children? Can a mother actually murder her own moppets? What if it is a setup or blackmail? This is insane. That's practically impossible. Questions and comments that run within the hearts of Georgetown folks who heard the story of Tracy, a lawyer, a wife, and a mother. It is said the line between good and evil is often blurred, and even the noblest of hearts can fall. How did they go from tears of joy to tears of pain? We are about to uncover the true story behind the murder of Shane and Sean, twins, brought into this world only for them to depart again just 7 months after birth. Welcome to True Crime Chronicle, where we serve you with true crime stories that keep you at the edge of your seats and wonder about the kind of evil that lurks within the hearts of men. Please like and hit the subscribe button if you're new, and to our already subscribed family members, welcome back. And as always, let's ride into mystery together. On the early morning of Friday, April 14th, Tracy and her husband Morgan arrived at Imel Hospital, carrying the lifeless bodies of their sons. The parents, visibly distraught, told doctors they had found Shane and Sean unresponsive in their cribs. But within hours, the routine procedures of an autopsy revealed something unexpected. The cause of death was strangulation. As the investigation unfolded, it painted a harrowing picture of mental health struggles and unspoken pressures within a seemingly happy family. Tracy, who had been suffering from postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder, kept her inner turmoil hidden from everyone, even Morgan. What began as fleeting intrusive thoughts eventually became actions, one she documented in a diary that would later become the key to understanding the tragedy. This story is not just about loss. It's about the pressures of parenthood, the silence surrounding mental health struggles, and the devastating consequences when help is not sought. In this harrowing story, we will piece together the events leading up to that fateful morning. We'll explore Tracy and Morgan's life together, the discovery of the crime, the investigation that revealed unsettling truths, and the courtroom battle that followed. Parenthood is often seen as the ultimate joy, a fulfillment of dreams. But it also comes with immense challenges. What happens when those challenges become too much to bear? What signs were missed? What steps could have been taken to prevent this tragedy? In this documentary, we'll uncover the layers of this case, beginning with the O'Reilly family's life before the twins were born. Then, we'll examine the night of the crime, the evidence investigators uncovered, and the heart-wrenching truths that emerged in court. By the end, we'll not only understand how this happened, but also reflect on the importance of addressing mental health with compassion and urgency. The story of Shane and Sean is a heartbreaking reminder of what can happen when silent struggles remain unheard. Their lives were short, but their story has much to teach us about the unseen battles faced by those around us. Tracy and Morgan O'Reilly seemed to have it all. Both were accomplished lawyers, known for their sharp minds and dedication to justice. Their marriage was admired by many, a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared ambition. To their neighbors, they were the epitome of success, a couple with promising careers and a bright future. But as with many stories, the surface told only part of the tale. Tracy was the kind of person who could command a room, her presence both professional and warm. She built a career in family law, navigating the complexities of broken homes with compassion. Morgan, on the other hand, was quieter, a steady force who preferred to let his work speak for itself. Together, they were a team, until their lives changed forever with the birth of their twin boys, Shane and Sean. The arrival of the twins was a moment of immense joy for the O'Reillys. After years of focusing on their careers, they had finally welcomed children into their lives, fulfilling a dream they had long held. The boys were beautiful and healthy, and Tracy was a natural mother, or so it seemed. Neighbors often saw her pushing a double stroller through the park, her face lighting up as she interacted with her babies. Morgan would beam with pride whenever he spoke about his sons. But behind closed doors, the challenges of parenthood began to take a toll. The sleepless nights, constant demands, and the sheer weight of responsibility that comes with raising two infants created a strain that neither Tracy nor Morgan had anticipated. Tracy, in particular, struggled in ways she couldn't explain to anyone, not even herself. Postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder is a condition that affects a small percentage of new mothers, yet it remains one of the least understood mental health challenges. For Tracy, it manifested as intrusive thoughts, unwanted, disturbing images and ideas that would flash through her mind without warning. At first, she dismissed them as fleeting moments of exhaustion, something any new mother might experience. But as the weeks turned into months, those thoughts became more persistent. Tracy didn't share what she was feeling with Morgan. He was already dealing with his own challenges. His law firm had been losing clients, and the financial pressure weighed heavily on him. Tracy didn't want to add to his burden. She told herself she could manage on her own. After all, she had always been the strong one, the one others leaned on. Admitting she was struggling felt like admitting defeat. On the outside, life went on as usual. Tracy returned to work part-time, juggling court appearances and diaper changes with the efficiency of someone used to managing chaos. Morgan tried to support her as best as he could, stepping in when her schedule became overwhelming. But as the days passed, subtle cracks began to appear in their perfect image. Friends and family noticed that Tracy seemed distant. Her once vibrant personality had dimmed, replaced by a quiet reserve. She rarely smiled, and her interactions with Shane and Sean, though tender, carried an edge of detachment. At family gatherings, she often excused herself early, citing exhaustion. Morgan, ever supportive, assured everyone that she was simply adjusting to the demands of motherhood. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. As Tracy's struggles intensified, she began keeping a diary, a place where she could pour out her thoughts without fear of judgment. The entries started innocently enough, reflecting her frustrations and fears. "I'm so tired," one entry read. "I feel like I'm losing myself." But over time, the tone of her writing changed. The entries became darker, filled with resentment and despair. She wrote about her longing for solitude, her yearning for the life she had before the twins were born. And then, more ominously, she began to express thoughts she couldn't take back. To her, they were just thoughts, written down and then pushed aside. But those words would later become the most damning evidence in the investigation. Morgan, for his part, remained unaware of the depth of Tracy's struggles. He was preoccupied with his own challenges, trying to keep his firm afloat while being present for his family. He believed that Tracy was handling things well enough, that her moments of distance were nothing more than the normal growing pains of adjusting to parenthood. He had no reason to believe otherwise. But in the days leading up to April 14th, there were signs he couldn't ignore. Neighbors reported hearing arguments from the O'Reilly home, something that hadn't been common before the twins were born. One neighbor described a particularly heated exchange just a week before the boys' deaths. "It was loud," she said. "I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded serious." Another neighbor noticed that Tracy had started avoiding eye contact during their usual morning chats. She seemed distracted, the neighbor said, like her mind was somewhere else. By the time April arrived, the O'Reillys were living in a fragile balance, each holding on to the hope that things would get better. Tracy clung to the belief that she could push through her struggles on her own. Morgan held onto the image of his family as it once was, not fully realizing how much had already changed. And Shane and Sean, innocent and unaware, remained at the center of a storm they could not escape. As we move into the events of that fateful night, the pieces of this tragic puzzle begin to come together. What happened to Shane and Sean wasn't the result of one moment, one decision. It was the culmination of months of unspoken pain, ignored warnings, and a system that failed to recognize a mother in crisis. It was just after midnight on Friday, April 14th, when Tracy O'Reilly awoke to the sound of faint cries from the nursery. Shane and Sean were restless, as they often were, their wails cutting through the silence of the house. Tracy lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Morgan stirred beside her, murmuring something incoherent before turning over. She didn't wake him. She never did. Tracy knew how much pressure he was under, and she convinced herself that handling the twins alone was her way of supporting him. She slipped out of bed and into the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. When she reached the nursery, the sight of the two tiny cribs side by side greeted her. Shane's cries were louder, more insistent, while Sean's were softer, more sporadic. Tracy moved between them, trying to soothe them with whispered words and gentle touches. But the cries didn't stop. They never seemed to stop. For the next hour, she tried everything, rocking them, feeding them, singing to them, but nothing worked. The twins, still too young to understand the world around them, couldn't be comforted. And in that moment, as their cries filled the room, something inside Tracy snapped. She later described it as a fog descending over her mind, a disconnection from reality that she couldn't control. To her, the cries weren't just cries. They were an unrelenting noise, an overwhelming force that pushed her to the edge. What happened next remains the most haunting part of this story. Tracy moved toward Shane first. She pressed her hands against his tiny chest, her movements deliberate but detached. His cries grew fainter, then stopped altogether. Moments later, she turned to Sean and did the same. When it was over, the nursery fell silent. Tracy stood there for a moment, staring down at the still forms of her sons. She would later write in her diary that she felt a strange sense of calm in that moment, a quiet she hadn't experienced in months. But that calm was short-lived. Reality crept back in, and with it, the enormity of what she had done. She stumbled back to her bedroom, shaking Morgan awake. Her voice, filled with panic, broke through his grogginess. "Morgan," she whispered, "something's wrong with the boys." He followed her to the nursery, his heart pounding as he saw Shane and Sean lying motionless in their cribs. He reached for Shane, his hands trembling as he tried to rouse him. "Call 911, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. The call came in at 1:37 a.m. Tracy, sobbing, told the dispatcher that her babies weren't breathing. Morgan could be heard in the background, pleading for them to hurry. When the paramedics arrived, they found Tracy and Morgan standing in the living room, each holding one of the twins. The scene was chaotic. Morgan's voice was frantic as he tried to explain what had happened, while Tracy stood silent, tears streaming down her face. The paramedics worked quickly, attempting to revive the boys, but it was too late. Shane and Sean were pronounced dead on arrival at Emmel Hospital. The attending physician, Dr. Harris, noted the absence of any obvious signs of illness or injury. Something didn't add up. He ordered an autopsy, suspecting there was more to the story. Back at the O'Reilly home, detectives arrived to assess the scene. At first glance, everything seemed normal. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of a struggle. The nursery was neat and orderly, the cribs carefully arranged. But as they looked closer, small details began to stand out. The twins' blankets were crumpled in a way that suggested more than just restless sleep. A faint bruise was visible on Shane's neck, almost imperceptible in the dim light. The initial interviews with Tracy and Morgan painted two very different pictures. Morgan was distraught, his words tumbling out in a frantic attempt to make sense of the tragedy. Tracy, on the other hand, was quieter, her responses measured and deliberate. She spoke of how she had tried to soothe the boys earlier in the night, how she had found them unresponsive hours later. Her voice cracked at the appropriate moments, her eyes filled with tears. But something about her demeanor didn't sit right with the detectives. By morning, the autopsy results were in. The cause of death was clear: strangulation. The news hit the O'Reillys like a thunderbolt. Morgan was devastated, unable to comprehend how such a thing could have happened. Tracy, meanwhile, reacted with a mixture of shock and indignation. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising. "I would never hurt my babies." As detectives dug deeper, they began piecing together the events of that night. The neighbors' accounts of arguments in the days leading up to the tragedy, Tracy's increasingly withdrawn behavior, and her decision not to wake Morgan despite the twins crying. All these details began to form a pattern. And then there was the diary. The diary was discovered during a routine search of the home. Tucked away in the back of a drawer, its pages were filled with Tracy's innermost thoughts. The entries spanned months, chronicling her descent into despair. One entry stood out among the rest. I long for peace. I long for silence. Goodbye, Shane. Goodbye, Sean. The words were chilling in their finality, a stark contrast to the image of a loving mother Tracy had worked so hard to maintain. By the end of the day, the detectives had enough evidence to consider Tracy a suspect. Morgan, unaware of the diary's contents, stood by his wife, insisting she couldn't possibly be responsible. But as the investigation progressed, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a revelation that would shatter their lives forever. Detective Sarah Coleman was assigned to lead the investigation into the deaths of Shane and Sean O'Reilly. A seasoned investigator with over 2 decades of experience, she had seen her fair share of tragedies. But even she was unprepared for the complexity of this case. What began as a suspected case of sudden infant death syndrome quickly unraveled into something far more troubling. From the outset, the autopsy results cast a shadow over the story Tracy and Morgan had told. Strangulation wasn't an accident, nor was it a condition that could happen naturally. It was an act of intent, deliberate and calculated. Detective Coleman's first priority was to determine how 2 infants could have met such a fate in what was, by all appearances, a loving family home. The initial interviews with Tracy and Morgan revealed contrasting narratives. Morgan was devastated, his voice shaking as he recounted the events of that night. He spoke of his love for his sons, the overwhelming joy they had brought into his life, and his disbelief at what had happened. His grief was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. Tracy, on the other hand, presented a more composed exterior. She cried during the interview, her voice trembling at times, but there was a precision to her responses that didn't go unnoticed. She described her actions in detail, how she had tried to soothe the boys, how she had found them unresponsive, how she had woken Morgan and called 911. But something about her account felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced these words before speaking them aloud. Detective Coleman began her work at the O'Reilly home. The cribs were meticulously examined, every inch of fabric, and would scrutinized for evidence. Forensic experts discovered faint impressions on the boys' blankets, consistent with the force of a small hand. The crumpled state of the bedding indicated a struggle brief, but undeniable. In the master bedroom, another clue emerged. On Tracy's nightstand was a journal, its pages filled with entries written in a hurried, almost frantic script. One entry stood out. I can't take this anymore. The crying, the sleepless nights, it's too much. While the entry alone wasn't incriminating, it hinted at a mother under immense pressure, a woman who was reaching her breaking point. Detective Coleman also turned her attention to the couple's relationship. She interviewed friends, neighbors, and colleagues, piecing together a picture of their life before the tragedy. Many spoke of Morgan as a devoted father, someone who had stepped up to support his family during difficult times. Tracy, too, was described as a loving mother, but there were whispers of tension. Some neighbors mentioned hearing arguments from the O'Reilly home in the weeks leading up to the twins' deaths. Others noted that Tracy had become more withdrawn, avoiding social interactions and skipping neighborhood gatherings. As the investigation deepened, Detective Coleman uncovered a troubling pattern. Tracy had been visiting her doctor regularly in the months following the twins' birth, citing exhaustion and anxiety. While postpartum depression was mentioned in her medical records, there was no indication that she had been diagnosed with postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder. Yet, her symptoms, intrusive thoughts, compulsions to check on the boys repeatedly, and an overwhelming fear of harming them, were textbook examples of the condition. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from Tracy's search history. Forensic analysts retrieved deleted searches from her laptop, revealing phrases like how to stop a baby from crying, ways to cope with intrusive thoughts, and, most alarmingly, how to make a baby stop breathing without pain. These searches, combined with the entries in her journal, painted a picture of a woman struggling with her mental health, her thoughts veering into dangerous territory. Detective Coleman's focus then shifted to the timeline of the crime. The 911 call placed by Tracy and Morgan was logged at 1:37 a.m., but the autopsy suggested the twins had been deceased for at least an hour before paramedics arrived. This discrepancy raised questions about what had occurred during that missing time. Why hadn't Tracy called for help sooner? What was she doing in those crucial moments? The turning point in the investigation came with the discovery of a second diary, hidden in a locked drawer in Tracy's home office. This diary, unlike the one on her nightstand, was more candid, its entries raw and unfiltered. In it, Tracy wrote about her intrusive thoughts in harrowing detail. One entry read, "I hear their cries even when they're not crying. It's like a noise I can't escape." Another entry was more ominous. "Sometimes I wonder if the world would be quieter without them." The final entry in the diary, dated the day before the twins' deaths, was chilling in its simplicity. "Goodbye, Shane. Goodbye, Sean." To Detective Coleman, it was the closest thing to a confession she had encountered so far. Interviews with Morgan provided further insight into the family's dynamic. He admitted that he had noticed changes in Tracy after the twins were born, her mood swings, her exhaustion, her moments of detachment, but he had attributed them to the normal struggles of new parenthood. He confessed to feeling guilty for not recognizing the severity of her condition, for not pushing her to seek help sooner. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the evidence against Tracy became overwhelming. The forensic findings, the journal entries, the search history, and the timeline of events all pointed to one conclusion. Tracy had been struggling silently, her mental health deteriorating to the point where she could no longer distinguish thought from action. Detective Coleman, faced with the weight of the evidence, made the decision to arrest Tracy on charges of first-degree murder. When officers arrived at the O'Reilly home, Morgan was visibly shaken, but he complied with their requests. Tracy, for her part, remained composed, offering no resistance as she was taken into custody. Her only words were directed at Morgan. "I'm sorry." The investigation had revealed a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, a mother consumed by her own mind, 2 innocent lives lost, and a family left to pick up the pieces. But the case was far from over. The courtroom would soon become the stage for the next chapter of this story, where the full truth would come to light, and the question of justice would be answered. The trial of Tracy O'Reilly began on a rainy Monday morning, and the courtroom was packed. Journalists, community members, and legal experts gathered to witness what had become one of the most shocking cases in recent memory. A mother, accused of taking the lives of her own twin boys, was now facing the full weight of the justice system. For many, it was unthinkable. For others, it was a question of whether justice would prevail or mercy would be granted to a woman struggling with her mental health. Tracy entered the courtroom wearing a simple black suit. She avoided eye contact with the crowd, her expression unreadable. Morgan sat in the gallery, his face a mask of sorrow and confusion. Despite everything, he had chosen to support her, at least in presence, if not in testimony. The community, once united in admiration for the O'Reillys, was now divided. Some saw Tracy as a monster. Others saw her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The prosecution opened with a devastating statement. Assistant District Attorney Marissa Lee wasted no time laying out the case. "This is not a story of tragedy that could not have been avoided," she said. "This is a story of choice. A choice made by the defendant, Tracy O'Reilly, to end the lives of her 2 sons, Shane and Sean." She detailed the evidence, Tracy's diary entries, the autopsy results, the bruising on the infants' necks, and the internet searches that spoke of premeditation. "We are here today to ensure that these 2 innocent boys receive the justice they deserve," she concluded. The defense, led by seasoned attorney Peter Calhoun, presented a very different narrative. "This case is not about guilt or innocence," he began. "It is about understanding. Tracy O'Reilly is a mother who loved her children deeply but was failed by the systems meant to protect her. She suffered from postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder, a condition that clouded her judgment and overwhelmed her sense of reality. She is not a criminal. She is a victim of an untreated mental illness. The prosecution called its first witnesses, starting with the forensic experts who had conducted the autopsy. Dr. Elaine Carter, a renowned pathologist, took the stand to explain the findings. She described the pressure marks on Shane and Sean's necks, the lack of defensive injuries, and the timeline that indicated deliberate actions. These were not accidental deaths, she testified. The evidence shows that the infants were strangled, and the force used was controlled, consistent with an adult's hand. Next came Detective Sarah Coleman, whose testimony detailed the investigative process. She described the discovery of Tracy's diaries, her search history, and the timeline discrepancies. What stood out to me, Coleman said, was the level of planning involved. The diary entries and internet searches showed that these actions were not impulsive. They were thought out. Her words left an impression on the jury, painting a picture of intent that was difficult to ignore. The prosecution also called neighbors and friends to testify about Tracy's behavior in the months leading up to the tragedy. One neighbor recounted hearing loud arguments from the O'Reilly home. Another described how Tracy had seemed increasingly withdrawn, her interactions with Shane and Sean becoming more distant. She loved them, the neighbor said, but you could tell something was wrong. She wasn't herself. These testimonies reinforced the idea that Tracy's actions were the result of a long, internal struggle. The defense began its case by focusing on Tracy's mental health. Dr. Caroline Hayes, a clinical psychologist specializing in postpartum disorders, was called to testify. She explained the nature of postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder, describing how it manifests in intrusive thoughts and compulsions. For someone suffering from POCT, thoughts of harm are not reflective of intent, she said. They are symptoms of a condition that distorts reality. Dr. Hayes went on to describe how Tracy's condition had likely gone untreated due to stigma and a lack of understanding, leaving her to battle her intrusive thoughts alone. The defense also brought Morgan to the stand. His testimony was one of the most emotional moments of the trial. He spoke about the joy the twins had brought into their lives and the changes he had seen in Tracy after their birth. She was struggling, he said, his voice breaking. I could see it, but I didn't know how to help her. I thought it was just the stress of being a new mom. When asked if he believed Tracy had intentionally harmed their sons, Morgan paused before answering. I don't think she wanted this, he said. I think she was overwhelmed. I think she was lost. The defense also highlighted Tracy's attempts to seek help. They presented evidence of her visits to doctors and therapists, showing that she had reached out for support but had not received the diagnosis or treatment she needed. Calhoun argued that this lack of intervention was a key factor in the tragedy. This is not a case of neglect or malice, he said. This is a case of a system that failed to recognize the signs of a mental health crisis. The trial reached its emotional peak when Tracy herself took the stand. Her testimony was a mixture of sorrow, regret, and confusion. She described her love for Shane and Sean, her joy at their birth, and the overwhelming pressure she felt as a new mother. I didn't want this to happen, she said through tears. I didn't know how to stop the thoughts. I didn't know how to ask for help. When questioned about the diary entries, Tracy explained that they were an outlet for her intrusive thoughts, not a reflection of her true intentions. Writing them down was the only way I could get them out of my head. I never intended to harm my boys. I love them so much, she said. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed Tracy on the discrepancies in her timeline and the internet searches. These questions were sharp, probing, and relentless. You wrote, "Goodbye, Shane. Goodbye, Sean. What did you mean by that?" she asked. Tracy hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. I was tired, she said. I just wanted the noise to stop. In their closing argument, the prosecution reiterated their stance. Tracy's actions were deliberate and premeditated. She made a choice, Lee said. A choice that ended the lives of two innocent children. Mental illness does not excuse murder. The defense, however, urged the jury to consider Tracy's condition and the lack of support she received. This was a tragedy born of neglect, not by Tracy, but by the systems that should have helped her, Calhoun said. You have the power to show compassion, to recognize that this was not an act of malice but a cry for help. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read. Tracy showed no visible reaction. Her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Morgan wept quietly in the gallery. Tracy was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after the first 10 years. The judge acknowledged her mental health struggles, but emphasized the need for accountability. Your actions ended 2 innocent lives, he said. While the court recognizes your illness, it does not absolve you of responsibility. The verdict marked the end of the trial, but it was far from the end of the story. For Tracy O'Reilly, life as she knew it was over. The courtroom, once a place where she fought for justice, was now where her own fate had been sealed. Sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, she was escorted from the room without a glance at the crowd that had gathered to witness her downfall. Outside the courthouse, the mood was somber. Reporters jostled for statements from the attorneys, friends, and family members. Morgan, flanked by his legal team, declined to comment. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the tragedy that had consumed his family. For him, the verdict brought no closure, only a painful reminder of everything he had lost. In the weeks that followed, Morgan retreated from public view. He sold the family home on Elm Street, unable to bear the sight of the nursery where Shane and Sean had spent their short lives. Friends described him as a man adrift, haunted by the memories of his children and the woman he thought he knew. He blames himself, one friend confided. He keeps saying he should have seen the signs, should have done more to help her. Morgan began attending grief counseling, hoping to find a way to process the pain. The sessions were slow and painful, forcing him to confront the anger, guilt, and sorrow that had consumed him since that fateful night. You can't rewrite the past, his counselor told him, but you can choose how you move forward. Those words became a mantra for Morgan, a lifeline in the darkest moments. For the community, the trial and its outcome left a deep scar. The O'Reillys had been a symbol of success, a couple many looked up to. Now, they were a cautionary tale. Parents whispered about the pressures of raising children, about the signs they might be missing in their own lives. Mental health professionals held workshops on postpartum disorders, hoping to educate others and prevent similar tragedies. Neighbors who once waved at Tracy in the mornings now spoke of her in hushed tones. Some expressed sympathy, arguing that she was as much a victim of her illness as her sons were of her actions. Others were less forgiving. Mental illness doesn't excuse what she did, one neighbor said. Those boys deserved better. Meanwhile, Tracy began her life behind bars. The adjustment was harsh, the stark environment of the prison a far cry from the comfortable home she had once shared with her family. At first, she kept to herself, avoiding interactions with other inmates. Her days were spent in reflection, replaying the events that had led her to this point. The weight of her actions, and the lives she had taken, hung over her like a shadow. Tracy's diaries became a source of controversy in prison. When excerpts were leaked to the press, they sparked renewed debate about her state of mind. Advocates for mental health reform cited her writings as evidence of a system that had failed her. Critics, however, saw them as proof of premeditation. She knew what she was doing, one pundit argued. She wrote it down, thought about it, and then acted on it. Over time, Tracy began participating in therapy sessions offered within the prison. She opened up about her struggles, describing the intrusive thoughts that had consumed her and the isolation she felt in the months leading up to the tragedy. "I didn't know how to ask for help," she said in one session. "I thought I had to handle it on my own." Her willingness to speak about her experiences earned her both sympathy and scrutiny, as the world outside continued to debate whether she deserved redemption. The O'Reilly case became a turning point in the conversation about postpartum mental health. Advocates pushed for better screening and treatment options for new mothers, arguing that Tracy's case highlighted systemic failures. Hospitals began implementing routine mental health checks for postpartum patients, and awareness campaigns aimed to destigmatize conditions like postpartum depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. But the case also sparked controversy. Critics questioned whether the legal system had been too lenient or too harsh. Some argued that Tracy's sentence should have been reduced, given her mental health struggles. Others insisted that justice had been served, that the lives of Shane and Sean demanded accountability. The debate extended beyond the courtroom and into the realm of public policy. Lawmakers proposed bills aimed at improving access to mental health resources for parents, while community organizations launched support groups for those struggling with postpartum challenges. The tragedy of Shane and Sean became a rallying cry for change, their short lives a reminder of the stakes involved in addressing these issues. For those closest to the case, the memories of Shane and Sean remained vivid. Morgan kept a photo of the twins on his desk, their tiny faces smiling back at him in moments of quiet reflection. He began volunteering with organizations dedicated to supporting grieving parents, using his own pain as a way to help others heal. In one particularly poignant moment, Morgan returned to the cemetery where Shane and Sean were buried. He knelt before their shared headstone, a simple marker engraved with their names and the words, "Forever in our hearts." For hours, he sat there, speaking to them as though they could hear him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Tracy, too, carried the memory of her sons with her. In her therapy sessions, she spoke of the love she had for them, the dreams she had for their future. "I think about them every day," she said. "I wish I could undo what happened. I wish I could hold them one more time." The story of Tracy, Shane, and Sean O'Reilly is one of unimaginable loss, of lives forever altered by choices and circumstances. For anyone experiencing postpartum challenges, know this: you are not alone. There is help available, and there are people who care. If you or someone you know is struggling with postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder like Tracy or any form of postpartum mental illness, take action today. Talk to your partner, a trusted friend, or a healthcare provider. Early intervention can save lives and provide relief from the overwhelming symptoms of these conditions.